Between July 1897 and March 1898, Seattle merchants sold as much as $25 million in goods to men heading north. Flour, bacon, boots, picks, tents, whole lives packed into one-ton outfits. Nearly 70,000 stampeders passed through the city. The gold was in Canada. The spending happened in Seattle. That was the trick. Long before airplanes, software, or online commerce, this remote port learned how to grow rich by becoming the door to somewhere else. Long before Seattle had a name, the land had already been built once. About 15,000 years ago, ice covered the Puget lowland in a sheet thousands of feet thick. It moved south with the patient weight of a continent, grinding rock, pressing clay, and dragging boulders beneath it. When the ice withdrew, it left behind a country of long ridges and deep channels, steep bluffs above salt water, narrow valleys filled with lakes, and hills aligned in the direction the glacier had gone. Elliott Bay was one of the dark spaces the ice surrendered. The shape was beautiful from a distance and difficult at close range. To the west stood the Olympic Mountains, often hidden behind cloud. To the east, beyond the lakes and forest, rose the Cascades. Between them lay a broken strip of ground where a person could stand beside salt water, climb a steep ridge, descend toward fresh water, then meet another ridge beyond it. Rain entered the loose sand and gravel and stopped against hard layers of glacial clay. Springs appeared on hillsides. Bluffs slipped. Streams found the lowest cuts and ran toward the bay. The first city here was not made of streets. The Duwamish lived through the waterways. Their name has been translated as the people of the inside, a description of those whose country extended through the interior rivers and lakes behind Puget Sound. Villages stood around Elliott Bay and along the Duwamish, Black, and Cedar rivers, beside Lake Washington and Lake Union, and farther east toward Lake Sammamish. The settlements were not isolated dots. Canoe routes, foot trails, kinship, trade, and seasonal movement joined them into a geography more complete than any map carried by the people who would later arrive. Water was the road that did not need clearing. A cedar canoe could leave the salt water of Elliott Bay, enter the broad mouth of the Duwamish, and pass into a river system much larger than the one known today. Before engineers cut channels and redirected flows, the Duwamish carried water gathered from the White, Green, Black, Cedar, and Sammamish systems. At its lower end, the river opened through mudflats, marsh grass, islands, and branching channels. The line between land and water moved twice each day. At low tide, the flats widened and shone. Shellfish lay beneath the mud. Birds worked the shallows. In season, herring gathered near the shore, and salmon pushed from salt water into the rivers that had shaped their return over thousands of years. Along the banks grew willow, alder, and cottonwood. Above them stood Douglas fir, western hemlock, and cedar, trees large enough to turn daylight green beneath their branches. Cedar entered nearly every part of life. Its wood became longhouses, storage boxes, tools, and canoes. Its bark could be worked into cordage, mats, and clothing. The largest winter houses held several related families beneath broad roofs of cedar planks. Smoke escaped through openings overhead. Inside were stored dried fish, baskets, tools, and the accumulated provisions that carried a household through the wet months. One of the old settlements near the mouth of the river was known as Haapus, later rendered as Ha-Ah-Pus. Archaeological evidence places a substantial village there by around the 7th century. It stood near rich tide flats where shellfish could be gathered, on a surviving bend of the original river. In the 19th century, elders remembered several longhouses and hundreds of inhabitants. The ground around it contained layers of shell, charcoal, bone, and household life laid down long before the first American cabin appeared. Farther north, near the shore of what would become downtown Seattle, other villages faced Elliott Bay. Trails climbed from the water toward Lake Union and Lake Washington. Some open areas in the forest were maintained with fire, encouraging berries and making hunting grounds easier to cross. The landscape was not untouched. It was known, named, traveled, harvested, burned, repaired, and remembered. Then, in the late 18th century, ships began appearing in the wider waters of the region. They carried metal goods, new trade, and diseases against which local communities had little protection. Epidemics moved faster than permanent settlement. By the time American migrants began looking north from the Oregon settlements, the country they called wilderness had already passed through losses they did not fully see. On November 13, 1851, the schooner Exact reached Alki Point after a rough 5-day voyage from Portland. The passengers came ashore in cold rain. The Denny, Boren, Bell, and Terry families, children among them, carrying bedding, tools, food, and the pieces of a settlement not yet built. Duwamish people met them on the beach and helped them raise shelter against the winter. Across the water, Elliott Bay curved beneath forested hills. The harbor was deep on its eastern shore. The trees stood close enough to become houses, docks, and cargo. The ridges behind them looked permanent. To the new arrivals, the place offered timber and water. To the people already there, it was a world of named crossings. The same shoreline held both facts. Before long, one of them would begin covering the other with streets. In March 1853, the silence at the foot of the hill ended. A steam engine began turning beside Elliott Bay. Belts tightened. Iron teeth moved through wet timber. Smoke rose above a shoreline of mud, driftwood, and cedar stumps, and the sound carried across the water. Seattle was still little more than a collection of cabins. Now it possessed a machine that could work faster than the hands that had built them. Henry Yesler had arrived the previous autumn, looking for a place to put a steam-powered sawmill. The settlement on Alki Point faced open water and winter wind. Across the bay, the eastern shore offered something more useful: deep anchorage, forest rising immediately behind the beach, and a steep natural route down from the ridge. The mill was placed near what is now the meeting of First Avenue and Yesler Way, where solid ground gave way to marsh and tide. Its western side stood on pilings driven into the shallows. A rough wharf reached farther into the bay. Sawdust, bark, broken slabs, and other mill waste accumulated around it, slowly hardening the edge between land and water. Seattle's first major industry was also one of its first acts of landmaking. The mill did not merely occupy the shoreline. It began changing where the shoreline was. Above it, the forest waited. The trees on First Hill were not decorative remnants between houses. They were the substance from which the town would be made. Douglas fir and cedar stood on ground that rose sharply from the bay. Men cut them with axes and long cross-cut saws, stripped away limbs, and brought the trunks toward a cleared path descending to the mill. Smaller logs could be dragged by animals. The largest were skidded over smaller timbers laid across the road, sometimes greased to reduce the friction. Then gravity took over. The trunks came downhill toward the water along the route that became known as Skid Road. Later it would be called Mill Street, and later still Yesler Way. The name outlived the machinery that created it. In cities far from Seattle, Skid Row would eventually mean a district where fortunes had reached the bottom. Here, at the beginning, the skid was literal. It was the useful descent of timber toward money. At the foot of the slope, logs were gathered in the water, then pulled toward the mill. A steam winch hauled them up an incline. Workers fastened each trunk to a moving carriage and fed it against the saw. The blade opened the tree in a spray of water and pale fiber. What had stood for centuries on the hill passed through the building in minutes and emerged as beams, planks, boards, and waste. The mill employed many of the white settlers and a substantial number of native workers. That detail matters because the first industrial economy of Seattle did not replace the older human geography all at once. It used people who already knew the waterways, the timber, and the country around the bay. Duwamish men worked beside newcomers in an enterprise cutting trees from Duwamish land, while the legal ownership of that land was being rewritten around them. For the newcomers, the mill solved the most immediate problem of settlement. It provided wages in a place where cash was scarce. It supplied boards for floors that had been earth, roofs that had leaked, and storefronts that did not yet exist. Its cookhouse became a place to buy a meal. Its hall became a place for meetings. The wharf received freight and passengers. Near the saw, a town began acquiring the ordinary machinery of permanence: a store, a hotel, offices, sheds, and rooms where agreements could be made. Seattle did not first gather around a courthouse dome or a church steeple. It gathered around a smokestack. The larger market lay far to the south. San Francisco had swollen after the California gold rush, and its growth consumed wood faster than the nearby hills could easily provide it. Buildings, docks, warehouses, mines, and ships required timber. Much of Yesler's production went down the Pacific coast to that booming city. Other cargoes moved to settlements around Puget Sound and as far as Hawaii. Seattle had no gold field. It had trees and a harbor, and for the moment that was enough. Ships arrived carrying tools, food, fabric, hardware, news, and people. They departed lower in the water, burdened with squared pieces of the forest. The transaction was visible from shore. A hillside became a stack of boards. The boards became a cargo. The cargo became money. Some of that money returned as more buildings along the muddy streets above the mill. The cleared ground widened. Stumps remained between houses like dark tables. Rain filled wagon ruts. Wooden sidewalks appeared where boots had sunk. The forest line moved eastward, and the road to the saw grew longer. Yet the mill continued to sit at the bottom, drawing the material of the hill through the same narrow point. For roughly a decade, it remained the principal source of livelihood for the settlement's male population. Other mills and businesses eventually appeared, but Yesler's machinery had already fixed the center of gravity. The waterfront was not simply the edge of town. It was the reason for the town. By the time Seattle was officially incorporated in 1869, more than 2,000 people lived there, where fewer than 2 decades earlier a handful of cabins had faced the bay. The growth looked decisive from the wharf. Masts crowded the water. Lumber piles waited beside the saw. Streets climbed into the cleared hills. But nearly everything Seattle sold still had to leave by ship. Behind the town stood lakes, forest, and the wall of the Cascade Mountains. The mill had given Seattle a way to reach San Francisco. It had not given the rest of the continent a way to reach Seattle. On July 14, 1873, a crowd gathered around Arthur Denny while he opened a telegram carrying the future of Puget Sound. Seattle had spent years preparing for this message. The Northern Pacific Railroad was pushing westward, promising to bind the Great Lakes to the Pacific with iron rails. Wherever its western terminus landed, land values would rise, warehouses would fill, and passengers from the eastern states would step from railroad cars almost directly onto ocean steamships. A town chosen by the railroad might become a city. A town passed over might remain a lumber landing. Seattle had not waited quietly. Its offer to the Northern Pacific included 7,500 town lots, enough paper property to scatter another settlement across the hills. It added 3,000 acres of land, $50,000 in cash, $200,000 in bonds, and space along the shoreline for tracks and a depot. For a town of wooden buildings gathered around a sawmill, it was an enormous wager. Seattle was offering pieces of itself in exchange for a place on the continent. Denny read the telegram. "We have located the terminus on Commencement Bay. The railroad had chosen Tacoma. At the time, Tacoma was scarcely a village. Its advantage was not a larger population, a busier harbor, or a longer commercial record. It lay closer to the Northern Pacific Line advancing north from Kalama on the Columbia River. Reaching it required fewer miles of track. Railroad agents had also quietly acquired land around the chosen site before making the decision public. The company would not merely enter the new town. It would own much of the ground on which the new town grew. The Northern Pacific called its settlement New Tacoma. Seattle had offered a city. The railroad preferred a place where it could build one. For the people standing near Denny, the decision rearranged the map. Tacoma was only about 40 miles to the south, but those miles now seemed to contain the distance between prosperity and obscurity. Freight from the interior could pass through Tacoma. Immigrants could settle there. Hotels, banks, grain elevators, and machine shops could gather around its depot. Seattle might continue sending lumber by sea while the age of rail moved around it. Then, 2 months after the telegram arrived, the financial structure behind the Northern Pacific began to collapse. On September 18, the failure of financier J. Cook helped ignite the panic of 1873. Banks closed. Credit disappeared. Railroad shares fell. Work continued long enough for the Northern Pacific's Western Division to reach Tacoma that December, but the great transcontinental promise stalled. The railroad had selected its city before it had secured its own future. Seattle had been rejected by a company that was now struggling to survive. That did not restore the terminus. It created an opening. Within days of the announcement, Seattle's leaders began discussing a railroad of their own. The proposed route would leave Elliott Bay, follow the Duwamish Valley, cross the Cascade Mountains through Snoqualmie Pass, and reach the farms and trade routes of eastern Washington. Its name announced the full ambition, the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad. Walla Walla lay far beyond the mountains, across forests, rivers, and high country that Seattle did not possess the money to cross. The name was less a description than a claim upon the future. A line drawn on paper could clear the Cascades in a few inches. Steel rails would have to do it mile by mile. On May 1, 1874, Seattle citizens turned out to begin construction. Men who normally kept stores, handled lumber, worked on the waterfront, or practiced law joined the labor. Brush had to be cleared, ground had to be graded, ties had to be placed by hand. The track was narrow gauge, cheaper to build than the broad lines of the great railroad corporations, and better suited to a company whose capital came from local pockets. The first obstacle was not the Cascade Mountains. It was the wet ground at Seattle's own feet. South of the town, the Duwamish opened into broad tide flats. At low water, mud stretched between shallow channels. At high water, the bay returned. To carry trains toward the valley, workers had to place track across land that disappeared twice a day. Wooden trestles went out over the flats on pilings driven into the soft bottom. Salt water gathered around them. Marine worms entered the timber and weakened it from within. The railroad meant to cross a mountain range. For the moment, it was fighting mud and small animals with hard shells. Progress slowed as enthusiasm met cost. James Murray Coleman, whose lumber interests had already tied his fortune to Seattle, assumed a leading role. He committed his own money and pushed other businessmen to do the same. Chin Ji He, a Chinese merchant and labor contractor, organized immigrant Chinese crews who extended the line through difficult country toward the coal fields east and south of the city. The work carried them not to Walla Walla, but to Renton. On March 7, 1877, Coleman operated the first train over the completed section between Seattle and the coal town. The locomotive was small enough to look almost delicate beside the enormous trees and timber trestles. Behind it came cars carrying a substance heavier and darker than the lumber that had founded the town. Coal altered the purpose of the railroad. The line no longer had to reach eastern Washington to matter. Mines around Renton and Newcastle were producing fuel needed by steamships, factories, households, and businesses around Puget Sound. Before the railroad, Newcastle coal traveled by tramway, lake barge, another stretch of rail, another barge, and finally wagon before reaching Elliott Bay. Each transfer required hands, time, and another chance for rain and mud to interfere. The new line gave the coal a more direct descent. By 1878, the tracks reached Newcastle. The entire railroad measured only about 21 miles, a short black mark beside the vast route promised by its name. It owned several locomotives, passenger coaches, and dozens of freight cars. Coal trains crossed the Duwamish Flats and arrived at Elliott Bay, where their loads could be dropped into bunkers and transferred to waiting ships. The Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad never reached Walla Walla. It never crossed Snoqualmie Pass. It never connected Seattle directly to the great rail network of the United States. It did something smaller and for the moment more useful. It made money. The profits from coal strengthened the waterfront, fed local industry, and gave ships another reason to call at Seattle. In 1880, Henry Villard's Oregon Improvement Company purchased the short railroad and its valuable access to the harbor. The failed transcontinental dream had become an asset large enough for an outside corporation to want. Tacoma had received the terminus. Seattle had received a refusal. Along Elliott Bay, coal dust now settled over the wharves beside the sawdust. Locomotive smoke drifted among the masts. Trains moved over wooden pilings toward a town still built largely of wooden walls, wooden roofs, wooden sidewalks, and wooden docks. Seattle had found a way around the railroad that passed it by. The answer was combustible. At 2:30 on the afternoon of June 6, 1889, Seattle was warm, dry, and made largely of wood. Front Street ran along Elliott Bay on planks supported by pilings. Its sidewalks were planks. Its warehouses, hotels, saloons, docks, and sheds were timber. Beneath the street, basements opened toward the tide flats, packed with paint, alcohol, shavings, crates, and the ordinary fuel of a growing commercial town. Even parts of the water system ran through pipes made from hollowed logs. In the lowest basement of the Pontius Building, near Front and Madison, an employee in Victor Claremont's cabinet shop was heating glue. The pot caught fire. Flames reached wood chips and turpentine on the floor. Water thrown onto the mixture spread the burning liquid farther. Everyone escaped the building. The fire did not. It moved through concealed spaces beneath the street, running where men above could not see it. Smoke pushed through cracks in the planking. Then fire broke into the open, climbed the wooden walls, and crossed to the businesses beside it. A liquor store added alcohol to the heat. The blocks nearest the bay began burning as one connected structure. Seattle's volunteer fire companies arrived with horse-drawn engines and hose carts. But the water system had been designed for a smaller place. Hydrants stood only on alternating streets. The mains were too narrow. Every new hose weakened the pressure in the others until streams meant for upper floors fell against lower walls. Along the waterfront, men tried to draw water from Elliott Bay. The tide was out. Mud lay between the pumps and deeper water, and some hoses could not reach the burning mill. Under the streets, wooden water pipes entered the same fire they were supposed to fight. The wind rose. Mayor Robert Moran took command as the flames advanced south and east. Buildings were torn down or blasted apart to make gaps. The fire crossed them. Crowds carried ledgers, furniture, trunks, and merchandise from threatened buildings, stacking the rescued goods on streets and wharves believed to be safe. Burning brands fell among the piles. Ships pulled away from piers beginning to smoke. By late afternoon, the commercial city was no longer being saved. It was being emptied. Flames crossed Yesler Way into the older district on the flats, where hotels, taverns, workshops, and small wooden buildings stood close together on pilings. Piers burned down to their supports, leaving posts in the bay like a black fence. Coal bunkers continued burning after the main fire had exhausted itself. From University Street south toward Dearborn, and from Elliott Bay east toward 4th Avenue, downtown became ash, brick shells, bent rails, and upright safes with nothing around them. Contemporary measurements differed, but one early account placed the scar at 116 acres, roughly 58 city blocks, with the waterfront included. Losses reached an estimated $20 million across banks, hotels, mills, newspaper offices, warehouses, and nearly every wharf. No human life was recorded as lost. At sunrise, Seattle still had its people, and almost none of the rooms in which they had conducted business. Tacoma sent a train north carrying volunteers, blankets, tents, and food. The city Seattle had feared as its railroad rival erected a relief tent where hundreds of homeless men slept on cots at night and ate at long tables by day. Other tents appeared across the burned district. Within a month, more than 100 businesses were operating under canvas, their signs hanging above white walls while ash remained underfoot. Seattle began rebuilding before it had finished counting what was gone. At 11 o'clock on the morning after the fire, more than 600 businessmen and civic leaders gathered in the surviving armory. They did not choose another site. They chose a different city. Wooden commercial buildings would be banned from the burned district. Streets would be widened and straightened. The ground itself would be raised. The old grade had always carried a problem. Downtown descended sharply toward Elliott Bay, and its sewers emptied into the water. At high tide, the bay could press back through the pipes. Streets near the waterfront sat on damp fill and timber over land the tide still remembered. The fire had removed most of the structure standing in the way of a larger repair. On July 1, less than 4 weeks after the first flame, Seattle adopted its first comprehensive building code. New structures inside the fire limits had to be brick or stone, with firewalls and heavier foundations. Reusable bricks were cleaned from the ruins. In the first 3 weeks, builders ordered 6 million board feet of lumber, not for another wooden city, but for floors, roofs, scaffolds, and the frames inside masonry walls. Property owners could not wait for the streets to be regraded, so they erected buildings at the old level. The city then built retaining walls along the curbs and filled the roadways between them, raising some streets as much as 22 feet. Storefronts that had opened onto daylight found themselves facing stone walls. A first floor became a basement. In places, a second floor became the new entrance. For a time, ladders and steep stairs connected the two cities. Pedestrians walked along the raised road, then climbed down to businesses still operating at the buried grade. Later, arched sidewalks crossed the gap. Small glass blocks in the pavement admitted a dim light below, where old doors, display windows, and sections of sidewalk remained beneath the rebuilt city. Within a year, more than 400 new buildings stood in or near the burned district. Brick arches and heavy stone filled the space where planks had carried fire. Seattle had not erased the town that burned. It had leveled the wreckage, built over it, and lifted the streets above it. The old city remained underneath, close enough to touch. The new city stood above it in brick, financed by banks in Seattle, San Francisco, and farther east. 4 years later, money would stop moving almost as suddenly as the water had failed on Front Street. At 3 o'clock on the morning of July 17, 1897, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer sent a sentence into the sleeping city. The steamship Portland was moving up Puget Sound with 68 passengers and more than a ton of Klondike gold. By 6, roughly 5,000 people had crowded onto Schwabacher's wharf and the nearby waterfront. Reporters had already gone out by tugboat to meet the vessel. When the miners came down the gangplank, spectators called for them to show the gold. Bags were lifted above shoulders. Men in the crowd were hired to help carry the weight ashore. The newspaper said more than a ton. Later accounts placed the cargo closer to 2. Either amount was enough to alter the sound of the city. Seattle had spent much of the decade recovering from the financial panic of 1893. Credit had tightened. Construction had slowed. The brick buildings raised after the Great Fire were solid and not always full. Now gold appeared on the waterfront in the hands of men who had gone north with ordinary tools and returned carrying fortunes. The gold field was not in Washington. It was not even in the United States. It lay in the Canadian Yukon, near the meeting of the Klondike and Yukon rivers, more than 1,000 difficult miles beyond Seattle. Yet the first great commercial consequence landed here, on wet planks beside Elliott Bay. Within days, clerks, laborers, shopkeepers, and professionals began arranging passage north. Some left jobs without knowing how to mine. The fever required a ticket, an outfit, and the belief that delay was more dangerous than ignorance. The outfit was the part Seattle could sell. Canadian authorities wanted each person entering the interior to carry enough food and equipment to survive for a year. By 1898, the required load amounted to about 2,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds of food, and 800 pounds of clothing and gear. A recommended list included 400 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 125 pounds of beans, wool clothing, rubber boots, blankets, rope, axes, picks, shovels, nails, a stove, a tent, and a gold pan. A man preparing to search for a few bright ounces first had to purchase a ton of ordinary weight. On First Avenue and around Pioneer Square, that weight appeared in public. Merchants stacked sacks, crates, boots, tools, and canvas along the boardwalks, in places 10 feet deep. Storefronts became outfitting houses. Counters disappeared behind rope and blankets. Scales stood ready. Flour dust settled on dark coats. Tin cups, frying pans, mosquito netting, and medicine were assembled for customers who had never slept outside. The city also sold instruction. Guidebooks explained routes. A mining school offered lessons in panning and sluicing. Shipping offices sold berths on vessels bound for Skagway or Daya. Hotels filled, then boarding houses, spare bedrooms, attics, and basements. Men slept beside trunks containing everything they expected to need for a year. The journey had barely begun. From the Alaska coast, the stampeders still had to carry their outfits over the White Pass or the steeper Chilkoot Trail. At the Canadian checkpoint near the summit, the Northwest Mounted Police inspected the loads. Beyond the pass, travelers waited for ice to release the lakes, built boats, and followed the Yukon River toward Dawson. Every pound bought in Seattle might have to be moved again and again by one pair of hands. Seattle was not the inevitable gateway. San Francisco had received the steamship Excelsior and its Klondike gold 3 days before the Portland arrived. Portland, Tacoma, Victoria, and Vancouver all wanted the same passengers, freight, and money. Railroads advertised competing routes. On August 30, 1897, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce created a Bureau of Information and placed Erastus Brainerd in charge. Brainerd purchased advertisements in Eastern newspapers and national magazines. He sent circulars to governors and mayors and arranged maps showing railroad lines converging on Seattle. One publication resembled an official government document. A display of $6,000 in Klondike gold traveled across the country, allowing crowds to look at the metal and remember the city named beside it. Seattle advertised itself as the gateway to Alaska. The gold was in Canada. The distinction did not slow the trains. Of roughly 100,000 people who set out for the gold fields, about 70,000 passed through Seattle. They waited for ships, ate in restaurants, drank in saloons, rented rooms, and bought the enormous collections of humble objects required to chase wealth. Between July 1897 and March 1898, Seattle merchants sold an estimated $25 million in goods. Estimated sales for all of 1896 had been only $325,000. 1 year's trade could once have fit into a few ledgers. Now it stood in mountains of flour sacks along the sidewalk. Most stampeders did not become rich. Many reached the Yukon after the best claims had been taken. Some turned back at the coast. Others abandoned supplies on the trails or waded through winter beside frozen lakes. The steamers continued leaving Seattle with decks crowded by people and cargo, while the city collected its share before the first shovel touched gravel. The rush eventually moved onward, to Nome, to other rumors, to other northern creeks. The Klondike gold was deposited, assayed, exchanged, and spent. Almost none of the metal remained visible. What remained were fuller banks, larger stores, busier docks, new hotels, and a name printed on maps across the country. Seattle had discovered that its most valuable resource did not have to lie beneath its own ground. It could stand between desire and a distant place, then sell everything required to cross the distance. Along the waterfront, freight continued to pile up. Behind it, the hills rose steeply, and the tide flats spread south in mud. The doorway had become profitable. It was still too narrow. By the beginning of the 20th century, Seattle had learned how to attract people faster than it could find level ground for them. The Klondike boom had filled its hotels, shops, warehouses, and wharves. Trains now reached the city from the east. Streetcars climbed into new neighborhoods. Seattle's population rose from fewer than 43,000 people in 1890 to more than 230,000 by 1910, enough newcomers to fill the old city several times over. But downtown remained trapped. To the west lay Elliott Bay. To the south spread the Duwamish tide flats, a broad, wet country that disappeared beneath salt water and returned as mud. To the north, Second Avenue ran directly into Denny Hill. Wagons strained against its slopes. Streetcar tracks bent around it. Commercial buildings reached Pike Street and stopped as if they had arrived at a wall. At the top stood the Denny Hotel, a vast Victorian building with towers, chimneys, and a view across the bay. It had been constructed as a monument to the city's confidence. The city decided to remove the ground beneath it. Seattle had already cut and filled smaller streets, but city engineer Reginald H. Thompson imagined the work at another scale. He regarded the steep grades not as permanent geography, but as defects in a street plan. Hills slowed freight. They interrupted rail lines. They consumed land that could carry buildings. The solution was not to climb them more efficiently. It was to make them lower. Work on Denny Hill began in sections near the end of the 1890s. Picks, steam shovels, horse teams, and rail cars removed some of the earth. Then engineers brought in hydraulic power. Pumps forced water through thick pipes toward steel nozzles called giants. The stream struck the hill with enough pressure to tear glacial clay and gravel from its face. The water did not dig a clean hole. It dissolved the landscape. Mud rushed into wooden flumes and temporary channels. Stones rolled through the slurry. Pipes carried the loosened earth downhill toward Elliott Bay, where material that had formed a ridge began settling into the water as new shoreline. The work exposed buildings in strange ways. Streets were lowered while some property owners refused to participate. Their houses remained on narrow platforms of original ground, standing several stories above the new grade. Stairways climbed from the road to front doors. Soil rose beside windows on one side and vanished beneath foundations on the other. These isolated shelves became known as spite mounds. They made the old elevation visible. A house could stand on one, surrounded by the absence of a hill. The Denny Hotel did not survive the transformation. Its towers had once looked over the city from the summit. By 1907, the building was being dismantled as sluicing operations approached. More than 3 million cubic yards of earth were removed during the first major phase of the regrade, enough soil to bury a football field beneath a mound more than half a mile high. Where a hill had blocked downtown, straight avenues extended north. The dirt did not disappear. Much of it changed address. South of the business district, another campaign attacked the ridge along Jackson Street. High-pressure water cut as much as 85 feet from the land in places. The mud was directed toward the Duwamish tide flats, filling marshes and shallow water with the substance of Seattle's hills. Earth from the Dearborn Street cut joined it. The city was lowering one neighborhood to manufacture another. Rails, warehouses, workshops, and streets spread across ground where tides had moved through channels and grasses. Pilings sank into the fill. Drainage remained difficult. During earthquakes, the loose, wet sediment would behave differently from the glacial ridges above it. For the moment, it provided what Seattle wanted: flat industrial land beside deep water. At the mouth of the Duwamish River, dredges performed an even larger rearrangement. Beginning in the first decade of the century, the Puget Sound Bridge and Dredging Company cut 2 navigation channels through the tide flats. The sediment was pumped between them until an island rose from the estuary. Harbor Island was completed around 1909 and 1910. At approximately 370 acres, it was then described as the largest artificial island in the world. Its surface was broad enough for shipyards, mills, fuel tanks, railroad tracks, and docks. A place where river water had once divided around mud and marsh now carried heavy industry. The river itself was next. The lower Duwamish had wandered toward Elliott Bay through bends, islands, sloughs, and tide channels. Between 1913 and 1917, dredges cut a straighter and deeper waterway. Curving sections were filled. Banks were hardened. About 4 miles of shoreline vanished from the shortened river, while ships gained a navigable industrial channel. The old estuary had provided salmon habitat, shellfish beds, and gathering places for Duwamish communities. The new waterway provided docks with right angles. To the north, engineers were opening another passage. The Lake Washington Ship Canal joined Lake Washington and Lake Union to Salmon Bay and Puget Sound. Excavators cut through land. Locks held back salt water and lifted vessels between levels. On July 4, 1917, the steamship Roosevelt passed through during the formal dedication. The celebration marked a new route from the inland lakes to the sea. It also marked the disappearance of an older one. When the canal opened, Lake Washington fell approximately 9 feet, really the height of a room and the floor above it. Docks stood over dry ground. Wetlands pulled away from their former shorelines. The lake no longer drained south through the Black River into the Duwamish system. The Black River weakened, narrowed, and largely went dry. Within 1 generation, Seattle had erased a hill, created an island, straightened its river, lowered its largest lake, and caused another river to disappear. The city had not conquered distance by waiting for the continent to come closer. It had rebuilt the ground from which it intended to reach the continent. The new land waited beside the Duwamish, flat, filled, crossed by rails, and open to ships. It needed machines large enough to occupy it. On the morning of June 15, 1916, a small biplane moved away from a wooden hangar on Lake Union. Its wings were covered in fabric. Wires held the structure rigid. 2 pontoons rested on the water beneath it, narrow and varnished like the hulls of racing shells. The engine turned behind the cockpit, throwing spray into the air as the machine gathered speed. Then the water released it. For a few moments, the B&W Bluebill flew above the lake, carrying William Boeing over the roofs, mills, boatyards, and steep streets of Seattle. The aircraft had been built locally. Its name came from Boeing and his partner, Navy Lieutenant Conrad Westervelt. The city had made many things that floated. Now it had made one that could leave the water. Seattle was unusually prepared for this kind of machine. The region possessed clear spruce for wing ribs, cedar for pontoons, and craftsmen who understood how thin pieces of wood could be joined without becoming weak. Shipwrights knew that a curve could carry more stress than a flat board. Sailmakers and seamstresses knew how to pull fabric tight without tearing it. Machinists from mills and shipyards understood engines, cables, bearings, and vibration. The airplane was new. Almost everything required to build it was not. William Boeing had first made his money in timber. His interest in flight grew alongside his interest in boats, and one of his yachts had been built at Heath Shipyard on the Duwamish River. In 1915, after years of watching other men fly, he finally rode in a seaplane over Lake Washington. The aircraft disappointed him. He believed a better one could be built. That belief carried the habits of the lumber business. A tree had grain. Wood bent differently depending on how it was cut. A poor board could be recognized before it entered the structure. At the Duwamish shop, Boeing once found a set of badly sawn spruce ribs, threw them onto the floor, and broke them beneath his shoes rather than allow them into an airplane. A wing could not be asked to forgive careless work. 1 month after the Bluebill flew, Boeing incorporated Pacific Aero Products Company. Its first headquarters occupied the former shipyard building beside the Duwamish, a tall wooden structure later known as the Red Barn. The river passed close to its doors. Timber, boats, rail cars, and industrial waste still moved through the same landscape Seattle had recently cut, filled, and straightened. Inside, the shipyard began learning another geometry. Boat builders George and Richard Pocock had come to Seattle to make racing shells for the University of Washington. Boeing admired the lightness and strength of their work and hired them to construct aircraft pontoons. They found that vertical grain western red cedar produced floats that were light enough to rise from the water and strong enough to strike it again. Other workers shaped spruce ribs and assembled wooden frames. Women sewed fabric skins by hand, pulling cloth over wings that looked almost skeletal before they were covered. The finished surfaces were tightened and sealed. Engines arrived from elsewhere, but the body around them belonged to the forests, workshops, and patient hands of Puget Sound. The first B&W aircraft did not interest the United States Navy. Boeing's young company might have ended there, with 2 experimental machines and an expensive building beside the river. Instead, a Chinese-born engineer named Su Wong helped design a new 2-seat training seaplane, the Model C. The United States entered the First World War in April 1917. The following month, Pacific Aero Products became the Boeing Airplane Company. That summer, Navy officials ordered 50 Model C trainers. The government also contracted Boeing to build 50 Curtiss flying boats. A company that had begun with a handful of people grew to a peak payroll of 337 workers. In the Red Barn, aircraft parts filled spaces once meant for boats. The Pocock team produced roughly 1 pontoon each day. Fabric, cedar, spruce, wire, glue, and metal fittings moved from benches toward final assembly. The order books had made flight into an industry. Then the war ended. Within weeks of the November 1918 armistice, military demand vanished. The factory that had been filled with movement went quiet. Boeing tried to keep his workers and machinery useful by making furniture, wooden counters, flat-bottomed speedboats, and other products that could pass through the same tools. The shipyard had learned to fly. For a time, it had to remember how to build furniture. Airmail gave the company another route forward. In March 1919, Boeing and pilot Eddie Hubbard carried 60 letters from Vancouver, British Columbia, to Seattle in a Model C, completing the first international airmail flight into the United States. The load was small enough to fit into a mailbag. The significance lay in the distance it removed. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Boeing aircraft grew beyond the Red Barn. Wood and fabric gave way to metal. Pontoons gave way to wheels. Small open cockpits became enclosed cabins, then long fuselages with rows of seats. Boeing Field opened south of the city, close to the Duwamish factories, giving land planes a broad strip from which to rise. In 1936, Boeing began using Plant 2 between the river and the airfield. The building was made for aircraft far larger than the Bluebill. Here, workers assembled the 4-engine B-17 Flying Fortress, its aluminum body bright beneath the factory lights. During the Second World War, production continued around the clock. At its peak, Plant 2 completed as many as 364 airplanes in a month, roughly one finished aircraft every 2 hours, day and night. Thousands of women entered jobs once held mostly by men, drilling holes, installing wiring, shaping metal, and driving rivets, whose repeated blows merged into a single sound across the factory floor. The plant was considered important enough to hide. A false neighborhood was constructed across its roof, with imitation streets, small houses, lawns, and trees intended to make the factory resemble an ordinary suburb from the air. Beneath that quiet landscape, bombers moved through the assembly line. Seattle had once sent lumber south in the holds of ships. Now it sent aircraft outward from the Duwamish, each machine carrying thousands of parts gathered from far beyond the city. The old isolation behind the Cascade Mountains mattered less when a finished product could climb directly over them. By the 1950s, the company born in a shipyard had entered the jet age. Its aircraft no longer merely connected Seattle to distant markets. They altered what distance meant. Across the city, payrolls, mortgages, machine shops, classrooms, and whole neighborhoods began moving to the rhythm of Boeing orders. The name appeared on paychecks in tens of thousands of kitchens. Seattle had found an industry large enough to occupy the ground it had manufactured. It was also becoming an industry large enough to hold the city beneath it. On April 21, 1962, 12,000 people sat inside Memorial Stadium waiting for the 21st century to begin. The man assigned to open it was not in Seattle. President John Kennedy was more than 3,000 miles away in Palm Beach, Florida. His voice came through loudspeakers, carried across the continent by telephone. Beside him rested a gold telegraph key. When he pressed it, an electrical signal traveled west and set the fairgrounds into motion. Fountains rose, bells sounded, the gates opened. The future had arrived by a technology already old enough to have wires. Beyond the stadium stood a city Seattle had built for 6 months and intended to remember for much longer. White arches framed pools of water. Aluminum roofs curved above exhibition halls. Flags snapped in the spring wind. A silver monorail moved overhead on a single concrete beam, sliding between downtown and the fairgrounds with no wheels visible beneath it. Above everything stood the Space Needle. Its legs rose from a foundation sunk 30 feet into the ground. 605 feet above the city, a saucer-shaped top appeared to rest on 3 slender supports. The tower had been raised in less than a year, its steel assembled under the pressure of an opening date that would not move. Its body was painted astronaut white. The roof was galaxy gold. The upper structure carried a revolving restaurant where diners could remain seated while Elliott Bay, downtown, Lake Union, and the mountain ranges slowly passed their tables. Seattle had spent generations cutting through hills and building across mud. Now it had placed a dining room in the sky. The fair was called the Century 21 Exposition. Its official theme was Man in the Space Age, though much of what it presented was not space itself, but the confidence space had produced. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing through missiles, satellites, classrooms, laboratories, and televised launches. The Soviet government declined to participate in Seattle. Its absence remained present in nearly every American display of scientific strength. The United States government committed more than $9 million to its science pavilion, a sum large enough to build a permanent white complex at the southern edge of the grounds. Architect Minoru Yamasaki arranged nearly windowless buildings around a quiet courtyard of water. 5 narrow towers rose above pointed arches, their surfaces pale against Seattle's gray sky. Inside, darkness replaced the courtyard light. Films, models, machines, and illuminated displays led visitors from mathematics and atomic physics toward rockets and planetary travel. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration exhibited spacecraft, satellites, and launch systems, whose shapes had entered public life before most people understood what they did. Children stood beneath engines large enough to dwarf a kitchen. Adults watched projected stars move across ceilings. The fair promised that science would not remain inside laboratories. It would enter the house, the school, the factory, and the street. Inside the Washington State Coliseum, visitors stepped into a transparent spherical elevator called the Bubbleator. It carried them upward into an enormous arrangement of thousands of colored cubes suspended above the floor. From there, the exhibit led them through a version of ordinary life in the next century. Homes would clean themselves. Electronic devices would reshape education. Machines would manage factories and farms. A commuter might travel in a personal gyrocopter or ride an automatic monorail. The future was shown not as ruins, wars, or crowded streets, but as a collection of solved inconveniences. Corporations built their own rooms inside that promise. Bell Telephone displayed communications. International business machines presented electronic computation. Ford Motor Company offered transportation. Boeing, whose factories had supplied much of the city's prosperity, placed aviation and space technology before visitors who could hear real jet aircraft passing above the region. By then, the Boeing 707 had already entered commercial service. Its swept wings and 4 engines carried passengers across distances that had once required trains, ships, hotels, and several changes of clothing. Seattle no longer needed to persuade the country that machines built beside the Duwamish could reach the world. The machines passed over the fairgrounds as proof. For visitors arriving by rail or highway, the monorail offered the first performance. It had opened 4 weeks before the fair and ran for about a mile between Westlake and Seattle Center. The 2 trains had been built in West Germany and arrived with rounded windows, polished sides, and interiors that looked cleaner than the streets below. During the fair's 6-month life, they carried more than 8 million passengers. At crowded hours, one train followed the other through downtown canyons, passing close to upper-floor windows before emerging beside the Space Needle. The monorail did not become the beginning of a citywide system. For most riders, it carried them from one end of the future to the other, then stopped. On the ground, the future contained grease, sugar, paper cups, cigarette smoke, and tired feet. Families moved between corporate exhibits and amusement rides. Children ate beneath the needle. Music drifted across the plazas. The International Fountain sent jets of water toward crowds who retreated, waited, and moved close again. Nearly 10 million visits accumulated between April and October, enough people to fill Memorial Stadium hundreds of times. They came through the gates carrying cameras and returned home with slides showing white arches, flags, rockets, and a tower shaped like something that had landed. When the exposition closed on October 21, Seattle did not dismantle its entire dream. The Science Pavilion became the Pacific Science Center. The Coliseum remained for sports and public events. The Opera House, exhibition spaces, fountain, monorail, and Space Needle gave the former fairgrounds a second life as Seattle Center. The city had gained more than buildings. For 6 months, it had appeared not as a remote lumber port or a wet industrial town behind the mountains, but as a place from which the next century might plausibly begin. At night, the Space Needle glowed above Queen Anne. Its revolving restaurant continued turning after the exhibits closed and the temporary pavilions came down. Below it, thousands of Seattle households depended on Boeing paychecks. More families would soon depend on them as the company prepared larger aircraft, new factories, and projects meant to carry human beings beyond the atmosphere. The tower pointed upward. Almost everything beneath it was tied to the same direction. In 1968, the parking lots outside Boeing's factories filled before sunrise. Headlights moved through the rain toward Renton, Seattle, and Everett. Engineers carried drawings into office buildings. Machinists passed beneath fluorescent lights and worked beside aircraft too large to fit inside the older plants along the Duwamish. Across the Puget Sound region, more than 100,000 Boeing paychecks entered kitchens, grocery stores, car dealerships, taverns, and mortgage offices. The company was building 3 commercial jets at once. The 727 was carrying passengers into smaller airports. The 737 had begun its first deliveries. At Everett, workers were assembling the 747 inside a factory so large that clouds could seem to gather beneath its roof. Seattle had spent nearly a century trying to overcome distance. Boeing had turned distance into a product. But airlines had ordered too many airplanes. The jet age had expanded quickly, and carriers had built fleets for traffic that did not continue growing at the expected rate. The 747 was magnificent and expensive. Its development had required Boeing to borrow roughly $1 billion, while costs for the smaller 737 had also exceeded expectations. By 1970, no airline in the United States placed a new order for any Boeing aircraft. For 17 months, the domestic order book remained silent. At first, the losses appeared as small absences, an empty desk, a drafting table no longer assigned to anyone, a parking space available near the factory entrance. Then entire departments began shrinking. Boeing had already lost thousands of workers through attrition in 1969. Layoffs followed. Hourly employment fell from about 40,000 people to 15,000. The company's corps of engineers and scientists, nearly 15,000 strong, was cut by more than half. Office staffs contracted. Managers disappeared from organization charts. Executives accepted reductions in pay, while the company searched for enough cash to remain solvent. In 1970 alone, Boeing dismissed about 35,000 workers. Another 15,000 followed the next year. The cuts did not stop at the factory gates. Small machine shops lost contracts for fittings, brackets, and tools. Restaurants near the plants emptied at lunchtime. Furniture stores waited for customers who no longer needed another dining table. Boats, cars, cabins, and houses appeared in newspaper advertisements at prices meant to produce cash quickly. A Boeing joke circulated through the region. An optimist brought lunch to work. A pessimist left the car running in the parking lot. Above this contraction hung one final promise. The Boeing 2707 was intended to carry hundreds of passengers faster than sound. Its pointed nose, swept form, and enormous engines belonged to the same future Seattle had displayed at the World's Fair. The aircraft would cross the Atlantic in a few hours. It would answer the British and French Concorde and the Soviet Tupolev. Airlines had placed orders before a prototype existed. Thousands of skilled workers were assigned to the program. They produced drawings, models, tools, calculations, and a full-size mock-up. The airplane changed shape as its weight and technical problems multiplied. Its movable wings were abandoned for a fixed design. Costs rose. Construction of the flying prototypes had not begun. The program depended upon federal money. In March 1971, Boeing employees gathered to hear that the United States Senate had rejected further funding. The project was over. Years of engineering remained on paper, and the enormous passenger cabin built to show what the aircraft might become would never leave the ground. One unfinished machine removed thousands of finished jobs. Seattle's unemployment rate climbed toward 14%. Across the wider Puget Sound region, some contemporary estimates placed it as high as 17%. The surviving employment figures differ according to the date and the area counted, but they agree on the scale. From more than 100,000 local Boeing workers in 1968, the payroll fell to somewhere between roughly 32,000 and 39,000 by the bottom of the collapse. More than half the industrial body of the region had vanished in 3 years. Families packed station wagons and trailers. Engineers who had moved northwest for the jet and space programs mailed resumes to California, Texas, and the East Coast. Houses remained on the market through another month of rain. Classified pages became inventories of lives being reduced. A fishing boat nearly new, a refrigerator, a bedroom set, tools, a car with payments remaining. Unemployment benefits ran out, were extended, and ran out again. Food banks and federal assistance reached households that had recently lived on aerospace salaries. Volunteers at the Seattle Crisis Clinic answered calls from people trying to endure the silence after steady work. The region's birth rate fell. On the Space Needle, built less than a decade earlier as an emblem of effortless ascent, an anti-suicide barrier was installed. The future was still standing. It had acquired a fence. On April 16, 1971, two real estate agents named Bob McDonald and Jim Youngren rented a billboard near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. They meant the message as a joke against the gloom surrounding the city. In large black letters, beside the drawing of a hanging light bulb, it read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Cars passed beneath it on the way to the airport. Some carried people leaving for interviews elsewhere. Others carried residents who had no intention of going. Photographs of the sign traveled farther than most of them and gave the recession a sentence the country could remember. The billboard lasted only a short time. The line did not. The lights, in fact, remained on. Boeing began hiring again in 1972 as military contracts and new work arrived. The 747 survived its dangerous beginning and became one of the most recognizable machines ever built. Yet the recovery was slow, and another national recession and oil crisis waited ahead. At night, the Space Needle continued revolving above the city. Beyond it, factory roofs lay dark along the Duwamish, while the illuminated windows of downtown reflected in Elliott Bay. Seattle had once grown by supplying distant frontiers with wood, food, ships, and airplanes. Now it was waiting for a frontier that might not require a factory at all. On January 1, 1979, Microsoft moved from Albuquerque to Bellevue. No ship sounded its horn. No locomotive crossed the tide flats. No new factory opened beside the Duwamish. The company's cargo consisted of instructions written for machines, stored on disks and paper, carried into a small office east of Lake Washington. Seattle had spent more than a century learning how to move weight. Logs had slid down Yesler Way. Coal had crossed wooden trestles. Gold seekers had carried one-ton outfits through its stores. Boeing had assembled aluminum bodies large enough to hold hundreds of passengers. Software required no cargo hold. 2 years after Microsoft returned to the region, International Business Machines introduced its personal computer with Microsoft's disk operating system. The arrangement placed the company's code inside a machine that other companies would build, box, ship, and sell. One set of instructions could be copied again and again without another tree being cut or another aircraft leaving the runway. The old geography had changed. A business beside Puget Sound could enter offices and homes across the country without sending a finished object through Elliott Bay. Microsoft moved to a new campus in Redmond in February 1986. The buildings were low and set among trees, more like a college than an industrial plant. Less than 3 weeks later, the company sold shares to the public. As personal computers spread through American workplaces, the money produced by software entered the Seattle region through salaries, stock, construction, and thousands of private decisions made around kitchen tables. The effect was physical even when the product was not. New houses climbed the east side hills. Office parks appeared beside roads once bordered by pasture and second-growth forest. Traffic thickened across the floating bridges. Engineers arrived with families and furniture, while restaurants, contractors, banks, and shops gathered around an industry that produced no smoke above its roof. Boeing had taught Seattle to sell the defeat of distance. Microsoft taught the region that distance might no longer matter. By the middle of the 1990s, another narrow doorway had opened. It appeared on computer screens connected by telephone lines, where words and small images arrived slowly enough to form row by row. In July 1995, an online bookstore began operating from a house in Bellevue. Its shelves were not meant to contain every title it offered. The customer searched an electronic catalog, selected a book, and sent an order through the network. Only then did the older machinery begin. A physical volume had to be found, packed, labeled, and carried to a door. Amazon's first frontier was invisible. Its consequences arrived in cardboard. The business repeated an old Seattle maneuver. The city did not need to manufacture the object or own the place where it originated. It stood between a distant supply and a distant desire, then made the crossing easier. Klondike merchants had placed flour, boots, and tools in front of men heading north. The online store placed millions of goods behind a search box and brought the customer to them without a wharf. Amazon moved into the old Pacific Medical Center building on Beacon Hill in 1998. The structure stood on a slope above the industrial valley, its narrow tower visible from highways and rail lines below. A company selling through the newest network occupied a building completed in the age of steam locomotives and ocean liners. A decade later, construction began on a larger campus in South Lake Union. The neighborhood had long been a working margin between downtown and the lake. In the early 1990s, it still held automobile businesses, warehouses, repair shops, and low industrial buildings. Interstate 5 cut it from Capitol Hill. Asphalt lots opened between structures whose roofs could be seen from the slopes above. Then the blocks began to change. Laboratories arrived. Office buildings filled former industrial parcels. Apartment towers rose where one-story businesses had stood. Glass walls reflected Lake Union, the same water from which Boeing's first locally built airplane had lifted in 1916. By 2009, Amazon's campus was adding another large concentration of offices to the neighborhood. The frontier moved once more. In 2006, Amazon launched a service that allowed customers to store data remotely. A few months later, another service allowed them to rent computing power without first buying and maintaining their own roomful of machines. The loading dock had become an internet connection. A new company could reach for servers as it needed them, use them for an hour or a year, and never know the sound of the fans turning inside the building where the work occurred. Seattle was no longer merely selling passage to a distant place. It was selling pieces of the distance itself. Yet the invisible economy left heavy marks. Concrete trucks lined city streets. Cranes turned above South Lake Union. Sidewalks filled at noon. Old buildings disappeared behind plywood walls, and property lines that had carried little value in the industrial years became foundations for offices and apartments. The transformation did not remove freight. The port still handled containers. Aircraft still rose from Boeing Field. Amazon's orders multiplied vans, warehouses, conveyor belts, and cardboard boxes far beyond the city. Software ran on physical machines drawing power in distant data centers. The frontier without freight produced freight everywhere else. From the upper floors of South Lake Union, Lake Washington is hidden behind Capitol Hill, and the Duwamish lies beyond downtown to the south. Down there, the river still passes beneath drawbridges and beside the broad roofs of industry. Barges sit low in the water. An airplane crosses overhead, briefly visible between clouds. Farther north, office windows begin to shine as evening gathers around the glass towers. Their work moves outward without a wake, entering houses, warehouses, hospitals, stores, and machines that Seattle will never see. The Duwamish continues toward Elliott Bay, dark against the filled land. Beyond it, the lights remain on.